Where you are going. Do you hear the mistake in the sentence? Hi guys, I'm Jordana, and today I want to talk to you guys about asking questions in English because I used a very simple example in the beginning of the lesson, which was where you are going. But even though that was a very simple sentence, asking questions can be quite daunting, which means quite difficult, can be something that most English students struggle with, especially when you have long sentences. And today, what I want to do is explain what the logic is behind creating a question. Because I think that when you understand the logic behind creating a question, it becomes much simpler. It's the whole thing. And this is something that I always try to do with my students. And even at work, I have another job. I work for a fintech. And even when I train people there, I always like to explain the why behind the processes, why we do things the way we do. I think it's always much simpler and much better to explain anything to someone if they understand what the logic is behind what you're doing, instead of just memorizing things, instead of me just coming to them and saying something like, this is how you need to do. Why? I don't know, just do it. I really don't like that. And I really don't like the whole textbook. This is what you need to do. This is what you need to memorize. I think English becomes much harder. Learning English, learning a second language becomes much harder if you're trying to memorize things without understanding how they work and why they work that way. But anyway, I digress. When I say I digress, it means that I'm completely talking about other things instead of focusing on what I want, which is to explain what is that logic behind asking questions in English. All right, before we start, I first need to explain to you how is the structure of a sentence in English as an affirmation. We're going to understand the structure as an affirmation, as a negative, and then we're going to move on to the question. First of all, if I have a sentence saying like, I want chocolate, or better yet, you want chocolate, that's an affirmation. I have the subject, you, I have the verb, want, and I have the adverb, the thing, the object that is going to complement my sentence, right? Which is chocolate. You want chocolate. Perfect. That's an affirmation. I am telling you, you want chocolate, even if you don't like chocolate. Okay. You want chocolate. That's an affirmation. If I want to put that in a negative structure, I can't say you want it, for example. I need something there to help me turn this affirmation into a negative sentence, basically. And for that to happen, I'm gonna use something that it's called an auxiliary verb. I need another verb because I already have a verb, which is want. That is my main verb. I need an auxiliary, some other verb to help my verb, to help my sentence. In this case, to turn my sentence into a negative sentence. And there are a couple of verbs that are called auxiliary verbs. So do and have are auxiliary verbs usually. And for example, in this case, do will be the auxiliary verb that I'm gonna go for. So for example, if I have the sentence, you want chocolate, that's the affirmation, I'm gonna use the auxiliary verb do, but in that case, in the negative form. So I'm going to say, you don't want chocolate. And the auxiliary verb usually, almost always, comes before the main verb. So I have help verb and the main verb. you don't want chocolate. So affirmation, you want chocolate. Negative, you don't want chocolate. And then when I want to turn that sentence into a question, I am also going to use the auxiliary verb. But when I ask a question, the auxiliary verb change places. In the negative, the auxiliary verb comes before the main verb, you don't want. In a question, the auxiliary verb comes before the subject. The subject here is you. So the auxiliary verb is gonna come right before the subject, and that sentence is gonna sound like, do you want chocolate? And then we also have the intonation of that sentence. The intonation helps show that it's a question. When I have a question, usually my intonation goes up. Do you want chocolate? If I have an affirmation, the intonation usually goes down at the end of the sentence. You want chocolate. So then you have the auxiliary verb there before the subject and the intonation at the end. Do you want chocolate? And if it's an affirmation, you don't include the auxiliary verb. You want chocolate, and my intonation goes down at the end. So what are the common mistakes that students make, that people make when they're speaking English and they want to ask questions, right? First one, it's mixing up the order. So for example, I have the question, where you are going? Do you see that I have the verb after the subject? That is classic affirmation structure, the verb after the subject, because I would probably say, you are going there, you are going to the cinema. And it makes sense when it's an affirmation, but when it's a question, I need the auxiliary verb before the subject. So in this case, it would be, where are you going, right? Because I have going right here acting as my main verb, and then are is the auxiliary verb in this case, and then are needs to come before the subject. Where are you going? The second most common mistake is forgetting to add the auxiliary verb. So for example, instead of saying, what do you want? You would say, what you want. And of course, in informal conversation, you will hear something like that. For example, what you want. Because then you're shortening the sentence, and instead of doing, what do you want? Someone would say, what you want. Or maybe if you shorten that, you can even say, what you want. So you see that I link the duh with the you. What do you want? What do you want? But the correct way to ask a question in this case, the best way for you to start training yourself, because then if you understand the correct way, then you can change that the way you want, right? You can start noticing how natives speak, like, okay, I can drop the do here, but at least you know that the auxiliary verb is supposed to be there. Then you will know the correct way. If you want to do it a bit different, if you want to be a bit more informal, you can. But then if you're in a formal situation, if you're at work, at least you know how to do the correct way. It's important that you understand how to do the correct way, because then if you don't do it, it's your choice, you know, it's not because you don't know. And the third most common mistake that people usually make when they're speaking English, non-natives, is that, remember that I talked about intonation a few minutes ago. Intonation is very important in any language. The words you say, it's not everything that there is to a language. Language is about the words, it's about the tone you use, it's about nonverbal cues, so nonverbal movements, so like facial expressions, body like cues, and intonation is something that is there and it's very important. So the third most common mistakes that students make when they're learning English is to not use the correct intonation. So that would be, if you're asking a question, the intonation goes up at the end. If you're saying a statement, if you're saying an affirmation, it goes down at the end. So what are you doing right now? What are you? The auxiliary verb are is coming before the subject here. So what are you doing? Doing is the main verb here. What are you doing right now? What are you doing right now? What are you doing right now? If I have the affirmation, that's gonna go down at the end. You're doing nothing. You're doing nothing. What are you doing right now? You're doing nothing. I'm assuming it was like the first thing that popped in my head. You're watching this, so you're not doing nothing, but you get what I mean. It was just an example. A few examples for professional context. If you're in a corporate setting or at your work, there are a few examples that I'd like to go through with you so you can understand how that would sound as a question, right? So let me grab my notes. And then the first one is, who is responsible for this project? So I have the question starter, which is who. And then right after that, I have the auxiliary verb, who is responsible for this project. The second one is, when will the report be ready? So I have the question starter here, when, because I want to know. So the difference between these is what is the information that you want. So who, you want to know a person. When, you want to know dates. If I ask why, I want to know the reason. And if I say how, I want to know the mode, like how something was doing, what was the process, right? So that complements to your question. I'm sorry, it was just a fluff, wandering, like flying around. Anyway, when will, and then I have the auxiliary verb here as well, will. When will the report is the subject of this sentence. So when will the report be ready? And then an answer to that would be, the report will be ready tomorrow. The report will be ready by noon. Third one, why was the deadline changed? So why, I want to know the reason. And then I have the auxiliary verb was. Why was the deadline changed? The deadline was changed because the client gave us more time. And then last one is, how can we improve this process? So I have the auxiliary verb can before the subject we, and then improve is my main verbs. How can we improve this process? The answer here could be, we can improve this process by being more proactive. So the main thing that I want you to understand here is that structure of the auxiliary verb comes before the subject, and if we answer in an affirmation, the auxiliary verb changes, or we even remove the auxiliary verb to help our sentence flow better. All right, so little recap. Things for you to keep in mind is that remember to use the right order for the sentences. Second thing is remember to use the auxiliary verb when it's needed. And the third one is remember the intonation. Intonation is important. What you say is important, but intonation is also very important. There will be a material linked to this lesson right down below to help you study all that I've said here better in the future. And if you guys like this, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Bye bye.